Hey guys, this is James from TeaDB, and I am joined again by Garrett.
Garrett, yes. Hey
Garrett
guys.
Is his name. This is the first episode we are filming in the new year.
Yeah.
So happy New Year, everybody. It's probably like 3 weeks late, but whatever.
Yeah.
So today, Garrett and I both brought our copies of this wonderful book, the Pu'er Tea, Ancient Caravans and Urban Chic. A word that I have mispronounced because I'm an idiot and I don't know what I'm doing half the time.
Well, chic it's a very forward word. I feel like
it is
talking about the contemporary and the
yes.
So you have to be really with it. I feel like,
which I'm often not. So, anyways, this book is definitely one of my absolute favorite books on tea. Definitely the favorite, actually. There's not a lot of books on tea that I read or enjoy reading,
right.
But this one is definitely like the exception.
Yeah, and I definitely have to second you on that in terms of really getting into the nitty gritty of tea culture in Yunnan. This book is like no other that I've read, especially for a Western kind of audience or English fluent audience. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Garrett and I will be talking about this book. This is not a book review, so we're going to be talking about some of the points within the book and sort of using that as sort of a springboard, talking points between each other.
Yeah.
So, did you want to start us off, Garrett? Did you have anything that you wanted to...
I think one of the main, kind of initial main points brought up in the book was the idea that Puer is... can be defined as a lot of different things, and although like as somebody who is exposed to it just initially from like internet culture and like what I've tasted from my own sampling, I like have my own idea of what Pu'er is, but when you get down into the nitty gritty of it, and like experiencing how tea farmers define Pu'er and how they defined kind of like, is it a area? Is it a specific way of processing the tea? Or is it a type of tea that can be aged? Or is it like an amalgamation of all these things?
Where does it come from? Another one. What areas and such. Yeah.
And so one thing in the book that I found really interesting is that the idea, like, they're along with kind of like the modernization of a lot of traditions and a lot of like, let's bring back some of this more heritage culture, in heritage like Chinese culture in the new kind of society. The idea behind kind of like, oh, we need to like classify it, we need to like narrow this down and have like one specific definition, and getting that is difficult, I feel like, for Puer.
Yeah, for sure. One of my big talking points, the first one that I have, is that Puer isn't one like big monolithic thing.
Right.
There are so many different narratives behind it that, like, I think we have a tendency we're definitely outsiders in Puer as Westerners. Like, most of it is happening in Asia and within China even. But one tendency I think we have is to refer to sort of like, Chinese Puer tea culture as this one big monolithic thing that's just like singular. It's like, this is how it is in China. They do it this way. This is the only way. But in reality, it is incredibly divisive, and there is a lot of disagreement and contention on what the definition of Puer is, what is like the authentic Puer, what type of Puer do I drink. The farmers might think one thing, but the people in Hong Kong and stuff like that grew up drinking Puer in like dim sum houses might have a totally different definition. Those people are both Chinese. I mean, one of them is the farmer. On one hand, it seems like that would be a very authentic viewpoint.
Right.
But it's very complicated.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things is how folks would tie their definition to Puer to their own cultural identity. So, for instance, if you're from a certain part of the country, you would tie like Puer as being a tea specific specific to and from the like Puer prefecture, like the Samao like area, and whereas like somebody from like Guangdong would like consider Puer more like, it seemed like when I was reading the book that she was kind of presenting the idea that like a lot of collectors were looking at Puer also from like an ageability standpoint, and there's a lot of like dark teas out there, but Puer is the one that, because of the large leaves, is able to age into something that's better, and then also the tasting like preferences for different areas to affected their definition. So like Taiwanese folks, it seemed like were more interested in like a warming tea or a tea that had a lot more like humidity in the storage, and therefore like kind of like that mushroom earthiness in the taste, which is like, I always like how it like being exposed a little bit to the Taiwanese Puer culture. Like I always kind of assumed that was the case, but it's interesting to see it kind of broken down in more of like an intellectual and like academic kind of perspective. Like, all right, we're actually interviewing people here, we're gathering data, and this is what it's kind of like. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, it's kind of hard to get like the different perspectives from the outside,
right.
Just because like we are here in the States, and we've both been to Taiwan a couple. Well, you've been once, and I've been a few times.
Right.
But like it's extremely limited in like what we see and stuff like that. So
yeah.
A lot of it is through observation,
Sure.
as sort of like an outsider's perspective, for sure.
Right.
And I mean, like, to the point, it's like this book will dive into sort of like the nuances of like Hong Kong people's preference of Puer and Taiwan people's preference of Puer.
Mm-hmm.
When like I think a lot of people will both see them as like old hats in Puer. Like they've been doing it longer than most people, and sort of treat their preferences as one. But like maybe Hong Kong people prefer tea from Monghai, ripe Puer and stuff like that is a little more popular there. Whereas sort of like these, like the Taiwanese were at the forefront of like the appreciation of like going back to Iwu and looking for that sort of Puer. So it even dives into sort of like those little differences, and we're not going to do a deep dive into that. Like we would pretty much be reiterating
the book.
Yeah. Let's keep going. And there's this one amazing quote that I have earmarked here, and it says, this quote is, "Our Puer tea is made from tender, fragrant tea leaves topped with the refined tea buds of the authentic tea mountain Iwu. Recently, fake Puer tea has emerged. Counterfeits are increasing, and fake tea is being mixed with authentic tea, which is hard to identify. Some shameless people have counterfeited our brand for their own profit. To forestall such bad effects, we changed our brand icon to 2 lions. Please note of our special description and avoid being cheated." So this quote, what I'm about to say where it's from, sounds an awful lot like, I don't know, Dai in like the mid 2000s or something, where fake tea is being flooded into the market. But this quote is actually from the 1920s or 1930s and is from the Tongqing Hao Puer tea label, which is one of those old Haoji Iwu brands.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. And so, and it just kind of shows you that, like, wow, some of this stuff has been happening for a very long time, and like the idea of like counterfeit tea and people sort of like up to some tomfoolery and whatnot,
right?
Like that's been happening,
right?
It's been happening for 100 years. Yeah,
it's not necessarily something that you'd associate just with the contemporary Puer scene.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting thing that the author kind of goes over, where people kind of are like exploiting the kind of grayness, the like kind of murkiness of Puer, the fact that like you can't always be sure exactly where the leaves that went into the cake were sourced from, unless you were the person to do that sourcing yourself. And I think that like in some ways that stands to benefit some people, like maybe some bad actors, like some people who are in it to exploit and kind of just cut like tea that's actually from the tea mountain that is as it's advertised, with like maybe like more border tea or just like more plantation tea. But I think that also the increasedness of like that grayness that I think she kind of refers to the idea of like being a warrior and going out and like trying to actually like get down to the nitty gritty of it, the actual authenticity of each individual tea.
Which she sort of refers to that person as Zhang Hu.
Yeah.
And martial arts sort of reference.
Right. Like you having to be like almost like a martial arts master in your understanding of tea, specifically Pu'er in this case, as to get down to like what it actually is. And that's for me is really interesting because as somebody who's not fluent in Chinese and therefore it kind of has like there's a break between the culture and like my ability to like explore the different areas in Puer. I find like myself always leaning towards things which don't actually declare like their authenticity, don't actually declare like they're maybe like a little more like edgy, and I think that's where she kind of touches on this like idea as being like, well, maybe it's not a good thing for Puer, like the market itself, that there's so much inauthenticity going on, but that was something that kind of came to my mind was the fact that like margins, the white label. That's something that came to my mind was the idea that white labels and margin tea might be where there's still value, even though specific mountains and specific areas now are like getting more like localized and more kind of like, oh, we're gonna declare this tea as this from this mountain because that's what kind of like the market demands.
I think that's sort of an interesting idea. It's sort of like there's almost more truth in embracing the ambiguity of something. It's being like, I don't know what the hell this tea is. It's from like I think it might be from this year to this year.
Yeah.
And that being sort of like a more appealing tea than something that's like, oh, we are a 1998 Guafeng Jai, which is like, I mean, like it'd be like clearly like a bullshit claim,
right?
So, but also one that's extremely specific, and it's sort of like, well, either this guy, the person that's selling the tea, is lying,
sure,
or they got lied to, and they were dumb enough to be blunt to fall for that thing.
Right.
And I see a lot of that, and like that doesn't necessarily even mean the tea is bad. We're kind of going on a tangent here, but like it's interesting because I also do that because that to me demonstrates that the person at least has an understanding and is willing to admit that they don't necessarily know everything about the origin of the tea and stuff like that.
Right.
One other thing I wanted to go real quickly back to this quote in the book is that it also, one of the narratives I'll see about Puer is sort of that, like, it's always been sort of like this cheap tea and stuff like that. And there's definitely truth in that.
Right.
If you look at sort of like the rising of like Chinese GDP and the rising of like the amount that they pay the farmers and stuff like that.
Right.
These farmers were making very little 30 years ago or something like that.
Yeah.
But the fact that people were faking this tea, Tongqing Hao, in like the 1920s shows that there was real demand for this tea.
Right.
And one of the chapters around that, one of like the subheadings around that point is literally called Historical Glory, and talking about how these areas had like this rich history. So even something as simple as that can be a little bit more complicated than people would think.
Right, and I think she mentions in the book, like in kind of like the 70s, 80s time frame, like farmers wouldn't even call a lot of the tea that they were producing, even though at its core was Pu'er. It was just like, oh, it's sun-dried tea. Like it's tea that's not even related back to Pu'er itself. So it's like a lot of that creation of that more modern narrative about the tea.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's see what is next. And I know one thing you wanted to sort of talk about was the trajectories and stuff like that. Did you have anything to refer to for that?
Well, in terms of trajectories, it's since a lot of the book is based off of kind of the 2007 bubble and the 2007 kind of like experience with like distributors and tea farmers and folks just kind of all kind of leaning on each other and buying up tea before it's picked, buying tea and just inflating the price. I also wonder, like I wasn't able to make any conclusions about this, but like I wonder about like an additional bubble now. Looking at a lot of like the Western vendors that I personally have access to online, and like looking at the prices in the last 3 years and seeing like, okay, so everybody's kind of like ratcheting up. And I know you've done some really good price analysis for a lot of vendors, and I wonder about like another possibility of an additional bubble for Pu'er specifically, but is it the same actions that are bringing on the increased price, or is it something that's a larger symptom of a growth in the like Chinese middle class or upper middle class, and therefore just supply and demand? I don't know. Yeah. So I was hoping to think a little bit more about that, but I couldn't make too many conclusions from my humble seat way far away in Seattle. But yeah.
Yeah, I guess another one on my list was sort of like the rediscovered authenticity, and this is a continuing theme throughout the book, I guess, is that like these farmers are rediscovering, or well, partially due to the market demands, are trying to make Pu'er tea. Like originally when the Taiwanese went back in, I believe it was 1994, there was like a whole Taiwanese expedition, I believe is what it was referred to in the book.
Yeah, which sounds like a colonial thing.
Yeah.
Like we went over with our ships and
well, they went back to Yiwu, and their tour guides were like, no, why would you want to go there? And they found some of the people that worked on those original, I forget which label it was specifically, but worked on those Halji productions, and used those people to sort of start recreating these teas and trying to make it sort of like in this traditional mode. Of course, throughout this time, Pu'er tea is being made by Munghai Tea Factory, but these Taiwanese, this group was specifically interested in creating tea from Yiwu, and sort of going back to these Halji teas, which are, for those not familiar, teas that were made before World War II, essentially, before pre-PRC. So 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, some of the popular labels are Songpin, Tongqing Hao.
Yeah.
Not to be mistaken with the modern ones, which are different. It's a whole nother topic there. And so the idea that sort of like these people, these Yunnanese, who many of them are older, are producing and learning the trade in a different way than they'd been doing for a long time, where they'd just been sort of picking the Malcha and selling them off to bigger factories and sort of learning like the fine processing. The book goes into like some of the regulations and stuff like that, but sort of like the idea of like this rediscovered appreciation. I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah, and like the idea that even with more governmental regulations like the QS standards, that farmers and processors are looking at ways of still kind of maintaining their small batch kind of boutique qualities within the market. And I think that was another thing, kind of like thinking about the future, is like the government's ability to kind of modify their quality standards to meet the kind of niche market, the artisan market of Pu'er. And because it's such a highly, it requires so much work, like processing in terms of like the initial leaf processing and the sun drying, and as well as like the pressing and the wrapping from there. It's such a human and like intensive process that I, compared to some of the like probably slightly easier teas to work with, I guess a concern of mine would be like the government's ability to either modify standards or tea processors' ability to kind of exist again in that ambiguity, that gray state where they are like kind of meeting the needs of the standard, but also kind of like, hey, we still got like this nice like small batch label that we're working on, and we're still able to like work within that area without like having to spend all that money on new infrastructure and like new tea spaces, which would also affect the price, I feel like, as well as like the legitimacy of the tea itself. So probably adding more legitimacy over time, but I don't know. Yeah, it's a concern of mine.
And I guess one thing that I had, and this specifically, it's a little bit tangential, but it relates to sort of like my own personal journey with both tea and Pu'er tea. Mm-hmm. This sort of idea of rediscovered authenticity, it's one that I can actually relate to personally in a lot of ways. For those of you that don't know, it's not something I talk about often, is that I am half Chinese. I'm fourth generation Chinese. Sure. And so I don't speak any Chinese, but my great-grandparents actually moved to the U.S., to Spokane, Washington, to start a Chinese medicine shop. Sure. And sort of like this. And so, I don't know, the ideas of like sort of cultural appropriation and stuff like that are really fascinating to me, and I don't necessarily have very strong opinions one way or the other on how it relates specifically to this, but sort of like this idea of me coming back to some of like this Chinese culture, like Pu'er is obviously tied with Chinese medicine in certain circles, something that I don't know the first thing about, right, honestly, and so I don't know, my story in a lot of ways could be related sort of to these farmers or these people, in the sense that, like, in many ways I think my family has been fairly typical of different generational immigrant families. Like the language, my mom does not speak any Chinese, she's Chinese, so it's just sort of like lose parts of that culture as time goes on. I didn't grow up necessarily with my mom making those sorts of foods and stuff like that. Right. But then sort of like doing it, and I actually do make a lot of Chinese food for myself. Yes. And so it's sort of this rediscovered authenticity, when in reality I've come to it, I guess probably a lot more similar to how like a Western, like a non-Chinese Western, like a white American or someone like that would have come into the appreciation of Pu'er. So it's something I think about a lot, because like in many ways I have similarities to Westerners, but I also sort of have this sort of background to my own, I don't know, family history, genealogy, sure, whatnot. And so, I just think it's interesting. And this book made me think about that whole stuff as well. Right. And like the function of that cultural narrative, like the ability that you're able to still continue with that on, I think, I don't know, like does that add any sort of like additional like valency for you in terms of like when you're drinking a tea or experiencing tea, like you mentioned like the medicinal qualities of it, do you think about like exploring more of those like areas now because you have that that history, that culture to draw on? You know, I don't. I'm not very drawn necessarily to the medicinal aspects of tea. Obviously, I pay attention to how tea affects my body, and sure, I try to be healthy about it, sure, which usually means consuming a moderate amount of it. Right. But like specifically diving into Chinese medicine and stuff like that and how it affects my body is not of particular interest to me. Okay. So that part of my family history, I don't know, I guess is not necessarily there. Sure. I have no idea. My parents, my mom's family did immigrate from Guangdong, so it is in like that sort of Pu'er hotspot area, as is the case of a lot of the immigrant families that moved here. Sure. So I don't know if like my grandparents or my great grandparents and my grandparents, so all of which have passed, drank Pu'er or anything like that. I really don't have any idea one way or the other. Right. Okay. But it's just an interesting thing to think about, I guess, for myself. Yeah. And
in terms of like other like more contemporary ideas of like the Puer culture, she kind of talked about in the book the ideas of like the online culture and like the online internet scene, and what she found was like a kind of a vast difference between like an in-person group in real life versus like the online group.
IRL.
Yes, in real life.
Versus the internet.
Yes.
Yeah.
And kind of like, did you notice any sort of like commonalities between that like coming experience that she had when she went to go do tea tasting after like meeting folks online, with like some of your own experiences with like meeting folks online, integrating with like the blog and like on Instagram and other areas?
So I think this is one area where there's definitely similarities, but I think there are also some pretty stark differences.
Right.
So in the book, for those of you that have not read it, towards the end, there is a chapter specifically on tastings and stuff like that. And it covers a number of different perspectives, but there's a big one put on by a Chinese tea website, I think at the end of 2007, something like that, where they brought on a series of aged, supposedly dry stored teas, and people came, it was free, and from what the author describes, it was extremely subdued in person.
Right.
People meeting each other for the first time. And then if you were to look at the discussion boards, like a couple days after, it was a lot of activity, and some of it quite vicious, from what I understand, online. And so sort of like this idea of like this subdued in IRL, but vicious online, I thought was kind of amusing. And like, I guess, anyways, go ahead.
She touched on like the ideas behind like saving face, and I think that might be true, especially with like pu'er drinking, and because she mentioned kind of like the idea of like people's ability to describe teas and use certain descriptors also marked kind of their status within the community. So like the ability to comment on certain aspects of the tea versus others were kind of like markers for them and their way to kind of experience the tea. But in person it was like more difficult because everybody had like their online kind of like personas to uphold, versus like they didn't want to like initially like kind of go back on anything or like insult somebody who had like a complete opposite perspective. So in that way, like I can kind of understand, although it's not as a big a thing culturally, kind of coming from the United States, saving face, I still kind of get that idea in terms of like still wanting to maintain a status within a group.
Right. No one wants to look like a complete idiot. I think I don't know if you call that saving face, but I feel like that is a universal human feeling, is not to want to be ostracized.
Yeah.
One of my favorites from the group is that there, of course, was like someone that the author chose to quote that was basically like, "Oh, the tea sucked. These are terrible. The tasting was terrible."
Yeah.
And it's just like
they picked the wrong teas.
I'm like, there's always that one guy, isn't there? There's always just that one person online, that troll probably made a fresh account.
Right. Yeah. Made a different name.
So I mean, like, even in the Western tea culture, sometimes we have like what are called shill accounts or whatever made by people, and so I mean, like, I think anyone online could relate to that sort of like community and that response and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So like the internet community is, I mean, there are definitely some similarities to the Western. It's not all like they have one idea, a singular idea of what's good tea, and they can agree on it. Let's see. One other note I had is like in everything, this sort of like pu'er tasting, as well as just when you go to the mountains, when the author goes to the mountains, Iwu, there are people just always complaining about each other. There's tension between the farmers and the people that end up making the pu'er labels and stuff like that, and the boutiques and whatnot. And there's just like always people complaining about one another throughout the whole book, and I was like, this part feels so real to me.
Right.
About just like part of it being interest, part of it just being like annoyance and whatnot.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I think that might be like a function of the growth of the price of Puer itself too, because I think there's more stress on like farmers to be producing and more stress on labels to be marketing in a certain way or producing a certain amount of tea. Like for instance, when somebody comes into like an area like Yiwu and like has been hired by a bunch of collectors, like say in Taiwan or something, he has to uphold or they have to uphold their image in terms of like the quality of tea they find, and there's only a finite amount. So like that adds like all these different like levels of stressors for folks, and in a way like creates a lot of friction. But also from that friction, I think there is also created like a lot of like interesting dialogues about tea and about like what's good. I know for myself, I'm always like looking at like new experiences in terms of different areas, different teas, different producers, and like taking the more like less, I'm sticking to one route and this is what I'm doing, but having like multiple routes of like going down certain avenues of Puer, and Puer like collecting and drinking is kind of fun. It's kind of nice.
Yeah, as a Westerner, and this is probably totally my perspective, but I always sort of like raise my eyebrows when one person has like one tea master, another loaded term in my vocabulary, and like I'm just not quite sure. I don't know. People are like, oh, my tea master says to do it this way and this way, and maybe their tea master is good, but maybe they're garbage,
right.
And like, or maybe they're like just somewhere in the middle where they have certain tendencies one way or the other. And so I sort of value, and again, this might be me as a Westerner, having sort of like the different perspectives and trying to understand to the best that I can, understanding my own limitations as well, sort of like how these interact, and like coming to a better understanding, perhaps more through different perspectives and more ambiguity. Well, I have just a few last things. I just love, in this book, I just love a lot of the contradictions. It hits the spot for me. So just like the differences between opinions and stuff like that. So I just noted a bunch of them down before we did. People in Yiwu generally dislike ripe Pu'er and regard it as unclean.
Yes.
Their Taiwanese consumers, at least in this book, generally don't have as favorable of a view of ripe Pu'er as the Cantonese, Hong Kong people.
Right.
Stuff like that. There's a point in the book where a Yiwu producer, Zhang Jinghong, in fact, Yunnan Sourcing used to sell some of their tea. I think a couple other people did as well, who generally sounds like a pretty well-respected producer. In Yiwu, he's sort of a middle-aged man. So he served a 1950s red mark from a Taiwanese trader who are customers of his. The idea sort of being to help him sort of develop a better understanding of it. And this producer, this person who's making tea under his own label and by all means seems well-respected, dislikes it, and he prefers the fresh tea. And I think that sort of highlights, the trajectory of certain people. I think in the Western sphere, we tend to get pushed towards this sort of idea of fresh tea, because so many of the teas, and this is one of my own pet peeves, is that so much of the Western tea ends up being, the tea sold to Westerners, that is, ends up being sort of like these really young Pu'ers, and there's nothing wrong with that. I just would hope for a little more representation. And so these people who are farmers, who are getting exposed to a lot of fresh tea, unsurprisingly, have more of an understanding and enjoyment of those teas rather than like these old Hong Kong stored teas. So generally speaking, it seemed like Yiwu tea makers don't really care for older Pu'er and aren't familiar with it, even though their consumers in many cases are looking to buy these teas in the hopes that they will become those older Pu'ers. So it's sort of like this interesting contradiction.
Right.
And go ahead.
And is it like, I wonder too if that's to the detriment of both folks, like if there's an over focus of like the farmers and the producers wanting to produce like newer teas without the consideration of doing like more blended and large leaf like pressings that are good for like aging over time. It wouldn't probably serve the folks who are also interested in like aging over time, even though Yiwu has like that kind of like tradition or like kind of that focus that a lot of folks want, which is like having this like really nice higher quality good Huigan to age.
Right. I mean, it can certainly inform processing and stuff like that. We talk about Pu'er being misprocessed when it's young and stuff like that. If these people are just aiming for sort of like that young Pu'er experience, then it could represent a problem. Let's see. So I have one last one where hobbyists in Kunming, at one point, there is a guy from Hong Kong that I think is the author's friend, who goes to Kunming and hangs out with some people. And it's generally a lot more genial than the other tea tasting, but it sort of shows that like the people in Kunming didn't really care for his older Pu'er, whereas he took him a bit to really appreciate the Kunming stored Pu'er and just the fresher Pu'er. And the author relates this to food and comments on how the visitor from Hong Kong gets sick and isn't necessarily used to the cuisine and the food. One of the Kunming people, the people from Kunming, goes to Hong Kong at one point and like doesn't really care for the Pu'er that they sell there, which tends to be darker or more fermented, and the food, but ends up coming around to both eventually. And just the idea that Pu'er in many ways is an acquired taste, I think it is sort of foreign for a lot of us Westerners, and so like these Chinese people have gone through a similar thing. So people in both these instances had literally grown up drinking Pu'er tea, but they're just totally different types. Totally different trajectories. And so that's all I got.
Sure. And the idea that there can be different types, the author commented on the idea that localization is kind of key to help build folks' ability like at the local level to market their tea and keep up the authenticity even with other teas coming in, other kind of like border teas or what some would deem as like inauthentic teas. She was saying that the focus on the localization has been like helpful for folks to be able to kind of still capitalize without kind of losing quality or losing their ability to I guess have like an economic impact for themselves. So like the ability to sell tea essentially, but the idea that there can be multiple like local ideas of which tea is good and which tea is not, I think is beneficial because you have this diversity. You have this diversity of experiences to draw on, and as somebody who's like myself, like who's open to like the diversity of like new experiences, I think that's where Pu'er like comes in and like top of my list consistently as like a tea that I want to turn to, that I want to be drinking, because there's so much interesting like different varieties, different ways of drinking, different areas where the tea was initially sourced or stored, and that I think is like a really top-notch quality to Pu'er. And
Pu'er, despite what some extremists on both sides might want, it's a really big tent. It fits a lot of people. There's a lot of different trajectories. I don't think we should be very dismissive of one approach or the other. If you prefer one approach, that's totally fine, and you should go with it. You might find that you resonate more with specific perspectives in this book. And go with that.
Cool. All
right. Well, on that note, thank you all for tuning in to this long episode. I think Garrett and I both highly recommend this book. So go on to Amazon or wherever.
Your local indie bookseller.
Yeah,
perhaps.
for us, which is Amazon.
Yeah.
If you're in Seattle.
Yeah.
And pick up a copy. I highly recommend it. And cheers, guys.
Cheers, guys.